Hello, my name is Dale, and I am the host of Coffee Time Again, Exposing the Truth. Today, we're going to expose the truth on the education system of the United States. We have a fine gentleman here. His name is Mark Taylor. He's going to introduce himself in a second, and we'll get started, and we'll have a beautiful show tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoy the show. Mark, it's all yours.
Oh, thanks so much, Dale. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here to chat to you about education. We're both sides of the pond, as it were, but I think there are so many sort of common threads that go through education, no matter where we are in the world. And as you quite rightly said, my name is Mark Taylor. I'm the host of the Education on Fire podcast, which started back in 2016. And I've subsequently recorded over 350 episodes now of various people within education, parents and mentors as well, with really the essence of the child being at the heart of what learning and education is, and how people can support them and how they can kind of really thrive. And I think it takes a community of people within the system and outside of the system to make that the best possible opportunity for them.
I totally agree with that. And we'll see what the similarities are between the system in the United Kingdom and the system here in the United States. And tell us about what is the differences. Can you elaborate a little bit on some of the differences?
I think the main difference here is slightly the way that it's sort of put together. I mean, it's much more kind of, I think, age related here in its terms as the testing and all of that kind of thing happens at certain ages, no matter where you are in that program of kind of having to graduate and that kind of thing. You've got testing going on around 7 and 11 and 16 and 18. And they happen whether you're ready for them or not, really, which is just one of those things which is obviously not great for everybody, because as we know that even within the academic year, you've got people who may be born in September and some born in August. They're nearly a year older than each other, but yet still have to sort of take the same exams in the same academic year, even despite those differences. I think maybe one of the main differences between the US and the UK is also that sense of how you can put the schools together in different categories. You know, we generally have mostly state schools here. They were originally part of the local education authority and run in that way, and now they're starting to become sort of multi-academy trusts, so the sort of groups of schools that are sort of coming together in that kind of way. There are some private schools as well. But you sort of have that sort of state or private, whereas I know where you are, between your sort of your public and your private and your charter schools in different ways. I think you've got more different options of education depending on where you're living.
So you don't have charter schools in the UK.
No, not in that same kind of way. I think the new thing that I've sort of noticed coming in is being this idea of sort of online schooling and how that can be adapted for people, partly because they want that environment to be able to work at home and at their own speed, or even if it's a live lesson in a certain environment that way, but also some people who actually may be gifted in some way or have activities which doesn't allow them to attend sort of traditional school, as it were. So maybe they're a sporting person who's traveling around the world competing and that kind of thing. Those sort of new options now of having online school in those versions of are sort of much more supportive, I think, than just maybe having a sort of a teacher that's going around with you.
I would think that would be because you get more access. I'm not a real favor of online teaching for younger students.
I think
Elementary and secondary elementary school. I think that is so important for the child to have other children around them for the social development as well as the educational development.
I agree. I think it's definitely important for the social development. I think the one thing that many people during the pandemic will have realized is actually how difficult it is to just be working within a screen when you are younger, when you've got younger children. I think it worked better, as you said, is the children got older, and I think it sort of got maybe easier for them when there was less time constraints as well, where there was some kind of interaction online, but then the ability to go into a bit of free study, which then sort of came back into another class rather than just the one lesson after another online. But yeah, there's obviously lots of different versions now, but definitely much harder and not very supportive, I think, for those younger children.
I totally agree with that statement. And the next question is, in secondary education, even online, how is sports Is sports really important in the United Kingdom as it is in the United States?
It is important. I think probably within the school system less so. I mean, I've just been watching some of the Netflix series about some of the football and basketball things that go on over there. You don't quite have that same intensity, maybe, or that kind of way into universities and colleges through the scholarship systems. But there is definitely a focus, and there was government funding for sport within the school system, and also actually been able to blend that slightly with some of the other subjects as well. There are sort of programs now where people are trying to sort of integrate that sort of maths and English idea within a sporting situation, which sort of helps their funding too. A lot of the sports that go on are sort of outside of the system. Most villages and towns will have a youth club or a youth team that does it that way. So I would you sort of have your school team, maybe in football or cricket, as it would do over here. But I think that the higher quality and the better versions of those are usually sort of outside of the school system.
You notice that, like here in the United States, a lot of the children lost time. They lost the ability to do math. They lost reading. They lost uh, other learning things that they learn scores, test scores on reading, arithmetic, and I forget the other one. There's a couple of them, but our test scores went down after the pandemic. Did that happen in the United Kingdom as well?
I think there was a definite dip in some ways, but then I think there was also a sense of, I guess in some ways, a lack of reality because the whole world had been sort of given a bit of a curveball. And
Yes.
so to kind of expect that when we then did the next test, it would be the same as it was before. I mean, I think that's unrealistic. If you're going to do it on the same parameters, because it doesn't take into account the fact that people have been in that situation, and even if they sort of change some of the format in order to make it like that, you know, if you think about the reality of how what percentage of a child's life, you know, they'd suddenly spent not in school and not interacting and not having that kind of day-to-day interaction with their teachers, it would make perfect sense that some things would have sort of slipped through the net and some bits of learning would have not necessarily worked. And that's not even to mention maybe some of the emotional things which have happened to them based on that, which would then obviously that's the foundation of any child is being happy and supported. So if
Yes.
they weren't feeling that as well, that's going to feed into sort of how interested in how they can actually take on those academic skills as well.
I totally agree with that statement. That's a wonderful statement. I'm glad you brought it up. And I was wondering, what is your background in education?
So my background from an education point of view comes through being a musician. I went to music college and studied drums and percussion, and I've managed to be a professional musician for about 25 years. And my sort of step into the education field was through teaching drums and percussion in schools, and then also doing sort of whole class workshops of samba and African drumming and getting to visit lots of different schools. And it was there that I was sort of seeing a lot of teachers in a staff room sort of hitting their head against a brick wall saying, you know, I got into this to kind of help pupils, to support children, to give them a chance. And here I am sort of time poor and swamped with admin and all of that kind of thing, not really being able to do what I wanted. But because I was in lots of different schools, I was also able to see that some schools were doing things slightly differently, or there was an organization or a way they were working which was being very supportive. And that was kind of the beginning of the podcast, really, was that sense of, I thought if I can chat to the people over here who are kind of doing great stuff and have great opportunities and are working well, maybe that teacher in the staff room who's not feeling very supported can kind of either bring some of that in directly or at least have that conversation with their leadership team to say, look, there's this charity doing this particular work, or this school is able to bring this program in. And so that was kind of where I really sort of got interested in how everyone's in a school supposedly doing the same kind of thing, but it looks different depending on their setup. And at the same time, my kids were going through school as well. And I was very interested in the fact that there were lots of headlines that schools would say, you know, about well-being, child focused, all of that kind of thing. But the reality of what my children were feeling sometimes, or what they were experiencing, wasn't necessarily what that headline was. And as a
Mhm.
parent, I was sort of very keen to sort of ask those questions. So a combination of that, sort of really understanding what it's like for my children to be in school, plus what I was experiencing going into schools. Yeah, I sort of got into it more and more and more, and that, as I said, led to the podcast, but also led me to being asked to be part of the National Association for Primary Education here in the UK, which is a non-political charity, but that had a real sense of kind of child first and child centered idea of what education could be, and that really sort of spoke to me because it's sort of independent from all the politics and everything else that's going on. It's like, what can we do to help this child today, and is what is currently in place helping them, and if not, what can we do to kind of support that?
The show I did on education brought up a couple of things to me that I've noticed that we're not teaching real subjects anymore, like math, arithmetic, math, sciences, uh, history. In fact, there's some school district here in the United States that are starting American history in 1860. They kind of left out 100 some odd Jews. And they're teaching a lot of the so-called woke. And I was wondering, is that going on in UK as well?
I think there's definitely a narrowing of the curriculum. And I think part of that is due to the testing and the way that countries and schools are kind of trying to have a table of how well they're doing. And the only way they can do that is kind of some of the black and white subjects in terms of knowledge base.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the hardest thing about that is, I mean, I'm a prime example that back in the 80s when I went to secondary school, we had to learn a musical instrument, and I kind of turned up and they kind of gave us a little chance to blow into a trumpet and hit a drum and play a clarinet and
Mm-hmm.
bow a violin, and I was given the opportunity to play the drums, and I thought, well, we've got to do it and it will last a few months and then I'll get on to something else. And I absolutely loved it, and it was then obviously became my career, but it was only the fact that it had that broad curriculum, the fact we had to do it to begin with, it opened my
Mm-hmm.
eyes and gave me that experience to be able to do that. I'm not sure that would have been the case now in the same kind of way. And I think that's incredibly sad, because for those children who, aren't mathematicians or struggle in some of those other subjects, if they've got a real skill in other things which they've not experienced, then they're really missing out on the opportunity in terms of learning where they may go later on in life, but also giving them the confidence and the understanding that they're worthy and their skill set is something different than what the school is saying. And I think that's a really sad thing when they don't get that opportunity. And it's not great for society, because we need a range of people with skills and emotions to be able to kind of make it a well-rounded world for us to live in.
Yeah, I hear you on that, because that's one of the reasons our schools test scores have gone down, is because they're not teaching the subjects, and what they're also doing, they're teaching to the test. Does that go on?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the main thing. My daughter has just completed her GCSEs, which you do at age 16 here. And I would say that her school was absolutely phenomenal at giving her the best opportunity of doing well in those exams. Whether they educated her well, whether they supported her in lots of ways. I mean, I think we did an awful lot of sort of parenting, which sort of helped give her sort of the breadth that she needed from an
Yeah,
emotional standpoint and a home standpoint, to give her the skills she needed to get
yeah,
through what was, a stressful situation. And I think you're right. Their schools are in a position where they're graded. Their whole reputations are based on those test scores, and it takes a very brave head teacher or leadership to kind of go the other way back and say, look, we know this is the type of education we want to give. We know the breadth is important, and all the sports and the music and the arts, as well as those academic subjects. And we also have evidence that actually, if you do that and the school is thriving in that way, the test scores go up, the children are happier, and it's a great situation to be. But of course, it takes many years to do that. And I think over the last few years, that's been eroded. And so it's very hard to get back. But that's really the biggest difference between our private schools and our state schools, is that the private schools still give you all those opportunities. Yes, because the parents can afford it and the funding is there and the situation enables that to be the case. But where that's the focal point of what's going on, everyone seems to win. And like say the other side of that is that it's just getting narrower and narrower. The teachers are doing a great job of what they're being asked to do, but that's not the same teaching and the same education that it was maybe a generation or two ago.
Yeah, because when I went to school in the 60s, we got shop, woodworking shop, metalworking shop, uh, all kinds of shop like that. The girls had home ec, or the boys now. I can, and I'm a firm believer in those. I'm a firm believer that not everybody's college material. Some people just don't need college or don't want college, and I was one of them. So I never went to college until I was in my 60s when I went to my first class. However, is that going on there where they're getting rid of a lot of the programs? I hear you saying that, but did they ever do anything like that? But they had
Yeah, I
shop and
think
metal.
yeah, they do something called DT, which is sort of design technology, which you have to do for the first 2 or 3 years, sort of age 11, 12, 13, that kind of age. Um, but I think even yeah, to be fair, even when I was doing it, it's such a basic level and doesn't necessarily apply to the real world that I'm not sure that even if you kind of felt an affinity with it, you'd necessarily feel like there was somewhere you could take it further. So I think even some of those subjects, even when they were more sort of prevalent, could be a little bit more focused on a real world situation. Because I think as soon as you have an education focal point, which is related to where you live, what you do, what you're trying to achieve, a problem you're trying to solve, then all of a sudden it becomes relevant. And then you can see where that skill set goes in as well. I mean, I think if maybe some of those subjects lasted longer, and so you had to do them maybe for all the time you were there. So, like say, your metalwork skills or your shop skills meant that you actually had the ability to use that in real life above and beyond just taking a class at school. Then I think that would be much more useful. But I kind of thought, if you had the ability to put up a shelf or to mend your car or to do something electronic in those ways, which would be helpful, then great. I think in my woodwork class, I think I made some kind of wooden boat,
Yeah,
which was, I guess, interesting at the time. I got to sort of use a few saws and things, but didn't sort of really sort of change my world in any particular way.
didn't change mine either, and I made a birdhouse. While I was in, and I would just, and, again, I just don't think that. Do you have trade schools in over there?
Yeah, so the things have changed slightly here in recent times. So you have to do sort of your traditional schooling to 16, which is how it was. And then you have to kind of be in education again, definitely for another 2 years. So some people stay on an academic route and then maybe go to university or college. Or you can go to a college and then you've got more of those trade focuses or kind of a
Mhm.
more sort of area specific bit of learning, which I think is a positive thing for many people. But I think it's something that some people they fall into a little bit rather than necessarily being something which they would have been steered towards in a positive manner earlier on. The other thing which is interesting is there are lots of apprenticeship degrees going on now here, which aren't even necessarily trade related. So you can do sort of digital degrees as an apprentice. So you sort of got a job somewhere and then you sort of come in and get sort of taught in that apprentice style with sort of day release into college as well. So I think the whole feeling of what an apprentice is and learning those sorts of things in that way has a different feel now, which I think is a positive thing, depending on not necessarily going to university or college for 3 or 4 years and then leaving and then trying to get a job. So I think that kind of transition works quite well. But I think that the trade thing is something yeah, like I said, once you sort of finish school and then you can start to go to college and then find certain areas, and I think that's that way of thinking. Right, I need a job, and then you sort of get the trade skills from there, and then you do your sort of day release into
Mhm.
any particular qualifications that you need.
Yeah, but when I was younger, I started working in the restaurant business when I was just starting high school, which I started at 14, I believe it was. I was in, no, I'm sorry, I was 15 when I started, and I worked in the restaurants that summer before. I was still 14, and spent 28 years working in the restaurant business. Never went to school, college, or anything. I'm a big supporter of trade schools, as I said, because I believe that not everybody is college material. And trade schools, I think, where they got, you can take computers. There's a company over here that actually gives out $1 million to various students for scholarships if they go to trade schools, not college. And out of curiosity, how is college funded in the United Kingdom?
So college and university, it works that you basically can go to college, but it costs you about £9,000 a year, which you don't have to pay, but goes as part of a loan. So eventually you have to pay it back. And then from there, you get a maintenance grant in terms of being able to live, which is related to your parents and your family home and their income, and that kind of gets added on to the money that you sort of basically take as a loan and then have to pay back afterwards. I don't know how it works in the US, but the positive thing about that is it sounds like it's a lot of money after 3 or 4 years, which of course it is in the headline rates, but you only ever pay this back as a small percentage of your income above a certain amount. And I can't remember exactly what that figure is, but let's say it's £25,000. So first of all, you have to be earning over a threshold before you pay anything back. So therefore, if you never get a job that covers that, then you don't. And then for every sort of few £1,000s that you earn over that, you pay a percentage of it, and you pay it over X number of years. So it may be £100 or £200 comes out of your salary each year. And of course, if you then earn a large salary, a larger proportion comes out. So it really, while it's not ideal because it was free when I went to college, at least it's an investment in your future rather than, like I say, the headline of sort of leaving with sort of 30 or 40,000 pounds of debt sounds a lot, but it doesn't work quite that way here, which I think is a little bit different from where you are.
I don't know how much that is in US dollars, but in the US, they're coming up with $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 to pay for their school. And the government, the US government, is the one backing all the loans. And there's a big push here to cancel those debts, which I think is absolutely wrong. But, because when I went to college, I paid for it. Even though I was 60 years old, I still paid for it. And so I am invested in my future. And I think that's true of not only in the United Kingdom, but in the United States, that if you value what you have an investment in, what you have of some type of investment, whether it's cash or time or whatever. I fully believe in that. And our education system is getting to the point here in the United States that it's almost, unless you're in a charter school or a private school, you're not getting an education. You're teaching to the test, which everybody has to take. And it's the same test across the country, I believe. And I just don't think that's right. I think we need to go back to the old ways. But maybe I'm just old-fashioned. What do you think?
Well, I think if the system's working, then everyone's leaving and doing very well. And I think you don't have to look very far to realize that probably isn't the case generally speaking. And I think the thing about paying for your education as well is that you're really then focused on what it is that you're investing in. Now, I think there are certainly a few years ago when it was free here that, there were people taking degree courses because it was just the next thing you did after you left school. It's good to have a degree, but whether you were doing it just because you had to, if you didn't have any real focus about what that degree might be, it might just be something you were quite good at. Whereas now I think there's a little bit more focus about what that is. And interesting what you said before about the kind of the trade school. I mean, my dad was a motor mechanic. And he left school around the age of 14 and didn't like school, didn't really get on with it at all. But he's always said that as soon as he had that opportunity to learn something he was interested in, he really loved cars, loved fixing things. And then when he then did his college course and got his qualifications within that, he really enjoyed it because it was something that he liked, something he enjoyed, and it was giving him that purpose because he knew he'd get that qualification, which meant he'd get a better job and more opportunities And he was in that profession all his life. And I think that's the thing about it being real world, about passion led, about an understanding of what you are. And that's where that sort of breadth of education and understanding really sort of kicks in first of all.
Yeah, as I said, that some schools are teaching classes, history from 1860s, leaving out everything from 1600 or 1400 or whenever, and coming forward with it then. Of course, and they don't teach world history at all. Yes, students today, what was the USSR? And they have absolutely no clue. It's like asking them to use a rotary phone. They can't do it because they're not being taught. And I think that's wrong. They teaching things like that in the United British history and world history and
You do, but I think in that same kind of way, they have certain topics that they do which have been around forever. So, certainly here they cover the Victorians, the Vikings, World War II, for example, and everyone will have done those things. But like you say, there's an awful lot of history around there, and also a lot of history which kind of affects the life that you live now. And I think actually one of those things about teaching to the test and actually having certain things that you have to cover means that you don't have the opportunity to have teachers just teaching the breadth that they need. Because I mean, at some point, I guess you have to have some kind of standardized testing in order to get the qualifications. I mean, that's a big conversation about how that will completely change. But if you've just got, the first few years of your education, maybe up to the age of 11, which is about a general understanding of everything that you need, general history, an overarching idea of geography and music and maths and English, that kind of really gives you a good starting point and everything. And then you can start to take on, as you get older, then that inquiry and deep diving into those other things and working together as teams and actually having a focus on what you want to do. Then it seems that would be a much more organic way to kind of be learning. But like I say, that's probably another bigger conversation.
yeah, it probably is. I'm not a sports fan. I don't watch any sports. I don't even talk about them on my podcast very often, except for situations like this. And I'm just wondering, because in the United States, sports is a big thing in high school and college both. It's a really big thing. But I think it's important they have some sports. But what the point I'm going to make though is about music, simply because music is important. I think that I took French horn. I played the French horn in grade school, in seventh and eighth grade. I got away from it, but the music itself gave me a background because I also had to learn how to read music. And we didn't get into the classical stuff either. We didn't go that far, but I learned some good background in discipline and practice. And I learned all those disciplinary things that I wasn't getting in school or from my parents for that matter. So I believe in that. I believe that music should be an integral part of our system. And it's not anymore.
Yeah, I think it really gives you, like I say, it gives you that kind of rigor in the practice and that idea of seeing how doing things regularly that you can't do become things that you can do. And you can sort of see that, the emotional connection you have for being a musician, the community of working in a band or an orchestra or learning those things. And like I say, not to mention, the skills that you're giving your brain, at any given time, you might be watching, listening, hearing, feeling, all manner of things in order to create this thing, which is very different than some of the other subjects. And like I say, whether you ever become a musician or you take it past that sort of high school level, those skills will set you up in so many different ways that you probably can't even quantify. But without it, I think you start to notice some of those missing pieces of a jigsaw.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Another question I had was, how are schools funded in grade schools, the elementary schools, the secondary schools? Are they funded by the government, or does the parents have to kick in some help?
No, they're funded by the government, underfunded. There's been teacher strikes and many things here, partly because of what they think teachers should be paid, but partly because of the lack of funding and the investment that's gone on for many years here. So basically, I think depending on the amount of pupils you've got in a school, there's an amount per pupil that the government then provide the school, which they then have to run the school with. And as I said, that's sort of been eroded over the years, and so there's obviously a finite budget for each year. So somewhere along the lines, you either can't put on some of those extra things or fund some of the activities you might like to do, or maybe you lose members of staff. So the government are funding it, but it's very underfunded here, and also sort of not very focused, probably in a way that would be very supportive. And it, like all these things, I think it's because there's, it's the political cycle, and depending on what the focus is at any one time, I think if we could take education out of the political system and have an idea of what we'd like to achieve and what we'd like to set up for our children generationally, across party lines, then I think that would be much better, because it could be funded properly. And we know that, as a society, if the better the education, the more supportive we would be, the more profitable we would be, the economy would be better, the education would be better, so hopefully the health would be better, all those sorts of things. It actually give back many times over. But when you've got a 4 or 5 year cycle each time, and it becomes a bit of a political football, then then it's very hard to see that changing. So it'd be great if another government comes in and says, great, let's give extra money to schools and it's going to be better. By the time all those new things have kicked in, you then get to the next 4 or 5 years, and then it might be someone else, and then that gets changed again. So the children kind of get caught in the middle, over the course of their school life. There might be very sort of 3 or 4 versions of what school is, depending on who's been in government and what that financial situation's been, and therefore what their actual experience is going to have been.
That's the way it is in the United States too. Our government, of course, funds all public schools. However, that's so underfunded that the parents are having to buy supplies for the school. So they're not just for their children, but to supply all, and they have fundraisings, and they have back to school drives where these, on the TV they advertise, fill a pack for a kid, donate so much money, we'll give a kid a full pack.
Right.
Is that happening in the UK?
Not, I mean, I think teachers do pay for some probably extra resources within their class. I mean, most schools will have a kind of a parent-teacher association where there'll be fundraising activities across the school year of, whether it's a fair or a fete or a quiz night or something like that. And that usually is quite successful, because the parents, I think, in that way feel like they're supporting the school. There's usually a substantial amount of money that goes into all of these things, and therefore that may pay for, sometimes I think one of the schools I was involved in, it paid for a minibus over a number of years, or gave the kids the opportunity to have a whole school trip that they wouldn't have normally done. So I think it kind of works more in that way here.
Okay, because they're buying notebooks and pencils and clothing, and there's all kinds of drives that they have here in the United States, because the schools are so underfunded. The teachers are so underpaid, which I am told. It's like the police department, they're underpaid too, and they just can't come up with any money. And they keep saying, I don't think,
I don't think we're that far away from that, to be honest. But it's a slippery slope, isn't it?
It very much is a slippery slope in paying for this. It all boils down to what are you paying for? Are you getting what you're paid for? And in the United States, I don't think we are, as far as education is concerned.
I think that's probably true, and I think it kind of goes back to that idea, as if you could have a bit more of a blank canvas, or you could sort of give people more authority and autonomy in what they're doing. Then that way, people know locally within their environment what would work best. Because this particular group of children need this, or this age group needs this, or we live in a rural part of the country rather than in a city, so therefore that's going to have different implications to what costs what where, and how you get to different things. Getting access to a museum if you're living in the country is very different than if you're living in a city, and
yes, it is.
And vice versa. So whatever those experiences happen to be. So I think, like I say, more money is always going to be better, but sort of focused money where giving it to the people who really know where that could be best spent. And I think that's that's really key. But like I say, a lot of their hands are tied in so many different ways that that's quite a long way down their sort of pecking order of what they need to do. And like you say, it's about what we can achieve today for the test for tomorrow.
Yes, I agree with you. That's a wonderful idea. There's an old saying that I use in my podcast on occasion. The philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in this next generation. How do you feel about that?
I think that's very true, and it kind of ties into a little bit of what I've found in recent times, that the schools as they are now are taught by and managed by, in terms of senior leaderships and governing bodies, by people who never knew a schooling in a generation when it was different. So they
Mhm.
might not have had free music, they might not have had this sort of broader curriculum. So even if they're kind of supportive of that kind of thing, they might not even know what that looks like because they never experienced it as a child.
Mhm.
And so it, like you say, it becomes that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways. So I think the further down that track we go, the better, or not the better, but like I say, it's going to be what kind of happens, because it's what people know. And also, I mean, it depending on how these things are put together. If the people who are making these decisions have a very kind of blinkered idea of what schooling is. I mean, most of the people in this country who are making these decisions all went to private schools and had a very excellent education, shall we
Mhm.
say. But they'd have no idea necessarily what it's like to be working in a normal school here. So I mean, how that can possibly sort of tally up. And the saddest thing for me is that I've had the opportunity to speak and work with some amazing people who've got great ideas, great experience, and great expertise. And they've even been asked to be part of government situations and bodies to give them feedback, to give them advice. And then all these things get put together, they get put into a report, and then they don't do anything with it. And you just think,
Yeah.
well, that's just a waste. It's a waste of money, and it's a waste of resources of the really clever, intuitive people who really could help the system as it is, even if you wanted to change it. But even keeping it as it is to some extent, but morphing it in a way that's going to help, it's often sort of not listened to. And so yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. But there are two sides to that coin. There's the kind of those big changes you'd like to make, but then there's also what I hear on a regular basis. It's the conversation you're having as a teacher or an educator or a family member to any child on any given day in any given situation, and to be
Mhm.
able to sort of support them in the way they can, in a generational way, to give them the advice and the situation and support them maybe with the opportunities we think might have to happen or should happen in schools in a different way. Then that's kind of what we can do to make a difference, even if we think it should be different within that sort of school system.
Yeah, I understand. I hear that. Uh, Here in the United States, we have a thing called school vouchers. If you live in this neighborhood, you have to go to that neighborhood school. But there's a movement afoot to give school vouchers because, like you said, the money's divvied out according to how many students are in that school. That's how they get the money. Per pupil, you get some X amount of dollars. But they're trying to come up with school vouchers where they will let you transfer. Say you go to this neighborhood, you want the school's better in the next neighborhood, you want to send your kid there, you can do that. That's not working out. We're getting a lot of feedback and a lot of blowback on school voucher systems. A lot of people don't like them because they don't want to pollute their schools. It's like when we started with busing. They didn't want that. The general population didn't want it. But it turned out to be a good thing. It took a while, but it turned out to be a good thing. It integrated the schools, which really helped things in the United States. Do you have anything similar, or do you have to go to the school you're closest to?
Um, you don't have to. I mean, a lot of people do for practical reasons. But
Mhm.
no, you don't have to. And I think it used to be easier to go to other schools. Um, but now I think it's harder because obviously a lot of the good schools, in inverted commas, are oversubscribed. So therefore they can be not selective as in you have to be this level of academic achievement, but we actually want to serve our local community.
Right.
So I think it's almost gone a little bit full circle now, that there are more people who are going to their local schools because they're the ones that are doing it. And also I think there's a little bit of maybe a political drive in that as well, because of course, if you've got a local school that's failing and everyone's going to a different school, then often it's the people who have the opportunity to go to a further school because they have transportation or parents that are able to do that.
Mhm.
So that school gets better and the local schools get worse. And I think that's one of the reasons, I think, behind here the idea of the multi-academy trust, where you can have a group of schools that they might be locally linked, but they can also be more regionally linked. And so that way, I think they're trying to reduce some of what you're talking about. So the impetus might be that we want you to stay in this local area, and actually the quality of education and the overall leadership isn't just confined to that particular school, because it's being supported by other schools in different areas as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with it. Because what they do here is they close the school if it gets too low a population. Fact is, they just closed 6 of them here in Denver. 6 schools because school population had got so low, it just could not afford them because they're all going over to this better school over here. And we're having 30 and 40 kids in the classroom, and I think that's absolutely abysmal. That's way too many for one teacher. Now, I was a therapist for a while. I was limited to 10 people in my groups for a reason. You can't deal with more than X number. I don't know what that optimal number would be. That'd take an educator to figure that out. But I'm just saying, it's having 30 people in a classroom, kids, it's just that you can't control them, let alone teach them.
And also you need to have a relationship with them, don't you, as well? So
Yes.
like I say, the more people you've got, the more it just becomes about producing what you've got to produce, rather than having that time and flexibility to have those
Yes.
conversations, whether it's within the class normal or like I say, some kind of extra support they may need.
Hmm. What about crime? Is there a large crime problem in your schools?
Um, Compared to my understanding of the US, no. And
No.
I think it's much different over here. You can't carry guns over here. There are some schools that I think would say knives are more of an issue.
Hmm.
And maybe it's probably more widespread than people think, but certainly some sort of inner city schools
Yeah.
and certain cities and certain areas have some of that related, and maybe some gang related activity going on. But I think compared to lots of what we perceive from the US and what we hear, I would say it's a much lower percentage.
Well, that's good. Crime is in the United States, especially in the inner city schools, just absolutely. Teachers are being sexually assaulted, they're being beaten, kids are being sexually assaulted and beaten, which is so horrendous, totally wrong in my opinion. And it's just the robberies are going on, and we have a gun culture in the United States. We just part of our culture is guns. When I went to high school, every kid in school had a pickup, except for me, and had a rifle and none of us shot anybody up. So we had a different type of culture back then than we have today with what's going on with all the crime. And it's not just in high school; it's down in grade school. They're bullying kids to get the school lunch money or the school lunch or whatever, and it's going on from kindergarten all the way through senior in high school. It's not just there. So if you got a lower percentage, that's excellent. I'm glad to hear that. Somebody doesn't have that trouble like we do.
Yeah, no, I think that situation would very much be the exception rather than the rule. So
Okay.
and probably and very unlikely to be at that sort of level that you're talking about. So yeah, I think we're
Yeah.
much luckier in that regard here.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Somebody does anyway, that they've got something going on within the school system, and you got teachers, and they have to be qualified. I hope. Just from somebody off the street, that they have somebody that's because we have colleges that are strictly teachers' colleges. They teach people to be teachers, and Do they have anything, specialty colleges like that? Or they have, or they just part of the general collegiate system?
So you would have the teachers are being trained in a teacher training college or
Mhm.
university, and then there are certain schools that are teacher training supportive and teacher training schools. So you would have some teacher trainers coming in for a few weeks a year to kind of to get that practical experience, as it
Okay,
were.
yeah.
So but they're very much integrated into what the school would normally be doing as well. So that's kind of the distinction, really.
But you do have interns coming in as it were.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of interns. I'm a big fan of learning on the job. I'm also a big fan of being trained to do a specific job. Because there are just some things you can't just walk out of the schoolroom and start to do. You can't write computer programs right out of high school. So you need something that's going to give you that background and help you get to there. And I'm so far removed. My grandkids are in school. My oldest granddaughter just got married, and I'm going, what's going on here? You know? So I'm just trying to figure out what else goes on that's different from, as your understanding, between the United Kingdom and the United States, as far as the schooling is concerned.
Um, I think there are lots of similarities. Like you say, I think probably the extremes are different. We talked about the sports,
Mhm.
and those kind of things. Um, I think, I mean, a uniform is something which is something I experienced when I spent some time when I was younger in America with doing some music tours, and the
Mhm.
majority of schools here have a fairly strict uniform policy, or certainly everyone dressing the same and being part of that school. Some of them are obviously extreme and incredibly sort of tight and well put together. Some of them are a little bit more general, maybe younger kids with
Mhm.
polo shirts and that kind of thing. But having a school uniform in that sense of identity is something which I think is important to the system over here in many ways. And I know the kids really like then having their mufti days, which is obviously their a charity event day where they might pay a pound or a dollar or whatever just to sort of come in their normal clothes. And I
Mhm.
know from the experience I had that I think some of the people I was staying with, they were sort of phoning 3 or 4 friends to find out what they were wearing because they were just wearing their normal clothes all the time
Yeah.
each day to work out
Yeah.
what they were going to do.
Yeah, I've heard tell of things like that. Most of the school uniforms here are in spiritual, religious schools, Catholic schools, and other ones. That's where they usually have the uniforms. Some schools do, and a lot of them have not dress codes where you have to dress, you know, appropriately for that particular school, whatever the school determines is appropriate. And they've had
Yeah.
children suspended from school for being outside of that prescribed dress code.
Yeah, so we kind of only sort of enter into that realm um the 2 years sort of post that normal education, so like
Mm.
17, 18, if you're in a sixth form college or taking sixth form in a school, that's when the uniform usually disappears, and then like you say, it becomes like a dress code and a set of requirements that you're supposed to
Yeah.
fit in. But that's I think that's part of the maturity in growing up, and I think it also gives kids a little bit of a chance to kind of push the barriers again a little bit. And it's
Hmm.
certainly something in my daughter's school they even mentioned on the parents' evening, sort of as in before they've even started this part of their career, saying, this is something which is important to us, and these things are here for a reason, and they need to stick to the code and all of those things.
Hmm.
They know what that is, and so I think it's hard. It's hard for them in ways at 16, let alone, like you say, for those that are maybe going to be younger.
Yeah, we didn't have we had a dress code at my high school, but it was a small rural school, so it wasn't real strict. And but I went to a high school in California that they very enforced the dress code because it was a large school. I mean, a very large school, and it was in a small town, but it was a large school. Out of, there was like 600 in my sophomore year. That's more twice as many people than my hometown had in one class. The sophomore class. And how do you teach that many people? How can you do that?
Yeah, I guess people are just making the most they can. And interestingly, the other thing about the uniform situation and also having a dress code is I can understand the enforcement to some extent because you want it to have a statement and a situation that's reflective of the school, but also sometimes it does sort of take away from giving the children the autonomy that they need as well. I mean, for example, there are some schools here, if their uniform happens to be, a shirt, tie, trousers, and a blazer, you know, they'll say, we'll tell you when we think it's hot enough for you to take your blazer off and not wear it in class or between classes. And there's part of me that thinks that that's just a blanket rule which doesn't need to exist because everyone's different. If someone wants to learn and they want to do the best they can and they're hot, they shouldn't need to have to someone tell them when they think they should take that off.
Yeah,
They should. There's enough wiggle room there to kind of have the best of both worlds.
well, I think that kind of thing is just being nitpicky. I agree with you. It's not a good idea to have somebody tell you, well, you can take off your coat now because it's hot. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a strange thing, and I think the kids are smart. They know what's going on. And they've lived through the pandemic. It was that kind of you have to keep your coat on and have all the windows open and have have it freezing cold because that's what we need to do because of COVID. And then the following year, it's kind of we're saving money, so you have to make sure that you keep all the windows closed and there's no fresh air and all of this. And they're just like, I kind of understand there was a pandemic, but somewhere there's a halfway house, somewhere there's a kind of, we need some fresh air, or we need to do this, or it needs to be sort of a certain amount of common sense so that we can actually, learn and have an environment that's going to be supportive for us.
Some people who get into power don't have any common sense left.
Well, there's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, it sure is. I'm about out of questions. We're running low on time, about 10 minutes out. So in closing, what do you want to say?
I think for me, one of the things that comes up a lot, one of the questions I ask on my show is, what is it about a teacher or a education experience that you remember? And the biggest thing I get back is how a teacher's made them feel. The fact they've been seen, they've had a conversation that's given them the confidence to thrive and to move forward. And based on that, it's given that particular person the chance to thrive in different areas of their life, as well as that maybe that particular subject. And I think that's one of the biggest things within education, despite all the things we've talked about, whether it's funding and uniform or lessons or whatever that, of course, they're important. But I think everyone can make a difference now in terms of how they kind of make somebody feel and that kind word that can make a big difference. And then also, around all of that, one of the things that's important to me on my podcast, Education on Fire, the fire part of that, the acronym we use for feedback, inspiration, resilience, and empowerment. And I think those are some of the biggest things from a learning perspective and an educational perspective, no matter what the academic subject, some of those things which are going to give you the skills and the understanding and the awareness that you're going to need as a child, as a pupil going on, and certainly as adults as well, because we can learn the subjects, we can study at any point in our life. It doesn't have to just be at school, which is what everyone's expected to do. But I think learning some of those skills, having some of those conversations, understanding how to deal with feedback, because people obviously often don't like it because they feel threatened, rather than it being an open conversation in a way of growing. It's great to be inspired, but then with that you need the resilience when it doesn't work. You need a way forward to kind of take that inspiration and take it into the next step to be able to make that part of your life. And I think that empowerment from a teacher's point of view is to kind of put all those things together and say, look, these are your options, these are your situations. It's down to you eventually. You have to take the baton and run with it. But hopefully if we've got those skills and the understanding that you need to be able to do that, you can make those decisions at any point, whether you're at school or after school or in college, or even if you've got a job, to decide what's going to work for you and how you're going to do it, and then pay that forward as you get older to the next generation. And hopefully that self-fulfilling prophecy then can start to sort of have a positive momentum. And I think if we can do that, then we're doing the best we possibly can, despite all those other things that we've mentioned before.
Yeah, I agree. I think you've got a wonderful point of view there, Mark. I'm very pleased to have had you on the show. I'm gonna end the show, but don't leave because I got a couple other things I need to let you know about, okay?